Hello, my name is John Mullin, and I'm a professor emeritus of urban planning at the University of Massachusetts at Amhurst, where my primary research interest centers upon the once and future New England mill town. Today, I would like to focus on the unique mill village of Shawsheen, located in Andover, Massachusetts. Today, we're going to talk about the American Mullin Company, the creation of the model mill village of Shawsheen, Massachusetts, and what it means in terms of mill towns in New England. Location of Shawsheen Village, it's on the banks of the Shawsheen River, approximately 25 miles northwest of Boston, in Andover, Massachusetts. Andover is a very famous town, not only for being the home of Phillips Andover Academy, but it is also the home of several industrial villages that have historic status. It's 3 miles from Lawrence Center, which is going to be a significant part of my story today. And nowhere could I ever see two places that were so different as Lawrence and Andover. Now, what is the significance? It was a model mill town. It was intended to serve as an example for other mills who were going to be building additional communities in the 20s. It was built of nostalgic residential design. It was a period of colonial architecture. It was intended to be an alternative to Lawrence. The mills were built in a modern mill design. Some people have even mentioned that they have Bauhaus overtones. It was built without cost, which is an amazing thing for a mill community. The American Mullin Company, which owned it, was flush with cash at the time. And as far as I know, and that's a caveat, the last comprehensively built mill village in New England. And finally, and one of the most unique features, it had the shortest lifespan of any planned mill village in New England. The motivation came from the rise of the American Mullin Company, living conditions in Lawrence, and the legacy of William Wood, about whom I'll speak later. The American Mullin Company rose out of the panic of 1893. This is one of the worst depressions that the textile industry had in the 19th century. It combined initially 8 textile companies into one. By so doing, it became the largest textile company in the nation, and its production center was in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Its headquarters was in Boston, and its sales office was in New York. A critical element in terms of Shawsheen being developed was the fact that the management of the company was so scattered. Now, Lawrence, Massachusetts, a lot has been written about it. It was the largest mill city in America. Extremely crowded and diseased, suffered from something that social welfare workers called huddled fever, based upon the filth, the small size, the unsanitary conditions that were there, and creating a real sense of mental fatigue. Above all, I think the key issue is that Lawrence was ignored by mill owners in terms of its workers, that in fact, at the time, about 1912, I don't think there's one mill owner that actually lived in corporate Lawrence. Key element that stimulated Shawsheen was the Great Strike of 1912, stimulated by a wage cut due to lowering of hours, expansion of slum-like conditions, and above all, the Great Strike. Now, I have a poem here that I'd like to read to you in terms of 2 stanzas, and it's called Bread and Roses, and it was written by James Oppenheim, and it has been associated with the strike. But no one knows how this association ever happened, but it is, and I have 2 stanzas. As we come marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing their ancient songs of bread. Small art and love and beauty their drudging spirits knew. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we come marching, we bring the greater days. The rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more the drudge and idler than that toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses. And the key element here that I want to get across is that the strike was more than just wages and more than just living conditions. It's really respect for the human condition. And I think that many of us often forget about that part of mill history. William Wood, president of the American Mullin Company and the leading textile manufacturer in the city. His response to this was to make minor improvements in Lawrence, but mainly to things not associated with the conditions of the workers. The evil conditions continued. And coming out of the strike, the American Mullin Company never invests in Lawrence again, and Wood, becoming aged now, begins to focus on his legacy. He comes up with an idea for a model mill village. Now, a brief point about Wood is that he was extremely well read on things, on planning of the period. He knew of Pullman, he knew of the Garden City movement, and he knew of the utopian and semi-utopian mill villages that were being built in Massachusetts at the time. He comes up with the idea that some authors have called the mill pastoral. It's aligned but not attached to Lawrence. In essence, it's cheek by jowl to the borders. He funds this village with American Mullin Company money and also his own. And indeed, when you look at property records, they constantly will have parcels that are AWC and parcels that belong to the Arden Trust, which is Wood's firm. He brought all executives together, and catch this key phrase, all executives, and he purchased land in Andover to make this happen. The Shawsheen Plan, 1,500 acres, housing executives and senior staff, neo-colonial residential character. They subsidized the village center. It's a guarded city layout with massive mills on the edge of the village. The juxtaposition of village life and 10-story buildings and 850,000 square feet of production space is really quite profound. The site plans is spread throughout extensive green spaces, parklands and recreation space. There's shops in the core, the AWC World Headquarters, Wood's Mineral Estate. The first ring is residential, the second is industrial, and the third is agricultural. The World Headquarters, if any of you know the post office in New York City, had all of the mass and presence of that. The manorial estate was really absolutely plush. It still exists, and you can find it today as Andover's Country Club. So it was really quite something. Now, unique structures, residential. Wood was really class conscious. And indeed, when even here, he came up with two forms of residential development. One was brick Shawsheen, named because the housing was built of brick. And the second is white Shawsheen, the housing was built of wood. And brick Shawsheen was for the higher management, middle management with the white Shawsheen. He also had some unique features that bothered him that he did not want to have built in his village. The first is no parking in the residential area. So for the affluent, he built this deluxe garage that still exists with Doric columns outside where the chauffeur would come on and pick up the car in the morning and put it back there so the cars would not be in the street. For the middle management, they had a garage off to the side where they could park them by themselves. No clothesline showing. He built a laundry in the mill village for people all to get together to meld, so to speak. No above ground waste containers, no fences. And so he had these elements that he personally liked, and he made sure they came in. No wires above ground. And finally, the key point here, and this is a lesson that should have been learned out of previous mill building exercises, he had no formal village governance. I think that's a pretty important point. Now, the commercial and administrative structures, Flatiron Commercial Building with a post office. The only governmental recognition of Shawsheen came because the post office approved a branch there. The massive World Headquarters building, an elite hotel spa. On this spa, there's some very interesting stories about this. Apparently that Shawsheen did not take prohibition seriously, and that the events that went on there were quite interesting. He built a stadium of over 5,000 people, more than the town of Andover itself, at the same time that the city of Lawrence was. So you had these two big stadiums just over the line from each other, and it just buggers the mind, so to speak, why that happened. Extensive recreation facilities, and he redirected the Shawsheen River. Industrial space. 850,000 square feet of production space in 2 buildings. Picture this in the village. 10-story warehouse holding 40 million pounds of wool. Created a train stop and trolley and created a system that 2,000 workers would be coming and going from the 3 miles of Lawrence Center or thereabouts each day. And so it must have been a massive place by day in terms of the movement of people. There was also an AWC Farm located in West Andover, just outside of Brick Shawsheen, and it provided food for the workers in both Shawsheen and Lawrence. The cafeteria that he built for the workers had room for 800 workers, and in the nighttime, that cafeteria was converted into a movie theater of 1,000 people. Now, what happened? It came together between 1923 and 1926, and it boomed. These were good years for the American Woolen Company. But in 1926, the company started losing money and lost $9 million in that year. At the same time, Wood became seriously ill, ultimately went to Florida and committed suicide in 1926. Almost immediately, the company began to disinvest. They believed that this was Wood's enterprise. He did this for his own ego and for his own well-being, and that it was outside of the primary interests of the company, particularly at a time when the company was losing money. Now, we look at this as a mill village and we say, what was missing? The first thing is the employee housing. Now, I want everyone to picture Lawrence as one of the highest, most dense cities in the United States, and having 2,000 more workers dumped upon them. There's no churches and meeting houses. And one wonders why Wood did not allow that to happen. And I can only surmise here, it was because he did not want the two groups mixing spiritually. And then the absence of local decisions. Lessons learned, I think it's important to note that aesthetically pleasing mill villages can be created if one does not regard the cost. They successfully apply Garden City principles, and they can combine the pastoral, agricultural, and the industrial. Finally, on this point, automobiles need not rule. The questions remain for us. Who cares for the workers, and why was this done without that? Where fits the diverse community? What is the corporate responsibility to its workers? Where is self-governance? And how did Shawsheen, in the end, help Lawrence? Afterward, mills now today in Andover are full of IT and high-tech firms and condominiums. The mill village is still full of its vitality. The Minerals Estate is a country club, and the village is now in a national register. And our final comment on this, it could have worked, and it could have been a significant model for the nation. And I think this might be our next paper. Thank you.